Russia's war on Ukraine is certainly not going the way it expected. The war has dragged on for 17 months now, and victory is nowhere in sight for either side. Coupled with the world powers backing Ukraine, both with words and their action in terms of giving them military aid, has only left Kremlin further rattled, and that has prompted Vladimir Putin to mobilize support for himself, for his fight and his country. Which is why we're seeing the Russia-Africa Summit in St. Petersburg, a second such summit since 2019. Now, Putin has built this two-day summit as a major event that would help bolster ties with a continent of 1.3 billion people that is increasingly assertive on the global stage. It's also important to know that Africa's 54 nations make up the largest voting bloc at the United Nations. So far, they've been divided on more than any other region on General Assembly resolutions that has criticized Russia's actions in Ukraine. Now, Moscow has accused Western powers of outrageous efforts, as they called it, to pressurize other African heads of state to not attend, which is why the attendance in this particular summit is going to be far lower than what we've seen in the past ones. What significance does this really hold, and how much of an impact is that going to have as far as the war goes? Let me begin by asking that to a Ukrainian member of parliament who joins us on this broadcast. Olesky Gorochenko, thank you so much for speaking with us here on News 18 Global. And I want to begin by asking you, only 17 African heads of state are attending this particular summit that Vladimir Putin thought is going to be a turning point as far as rallying support for himself goes. Why do you think that's happening?
I think that the attempt of Putin to show that he has support in global south countries, in African countries, failed. Because from 54 countries which were announced, just 17 presidents are present in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, and in Russia. So they failed to show kind of a big support for Russia in Africa. And it's clear why, because Russia is disrupting the international law, international order, from which all countries will suffer. Because if you can change the borders with the brutal force, every country in the world will suffer from it. And also, like by what Putin is doing right now, destroying Ukrainian port infrastructure, especially in the ports of Odessa, that disrupts Ukrainian agricultural export, and that causes the inflation, the peaking of food prices, from which, like for rich countries, it means just inflation, but for poor countries, it means starvation. And in many countries of Africa, people are now starving because of what Putin is doing in the Black Sea, attacking agricultural export and causing chaos in the world.
Right, like you mentioned, the Black Sea Grain Initiative and Russia withdrawing out of it, many African leaders see that as a stab in the back, really. Do you think Putin can actually count on these leaders that are congregating in St. Petersburg, or that these leaders would actually come out and support Vladimir Putin and Russia in this fight is concerned, because the after effects are being felt for them as well?
I think that there will be new pressure from African countries also on Putin to restore the grain corridor and grain initiative, because their people are suffering from this enormously. So I think that one of the reasons of this summit in general is attempt of Putin to calm African leaders, but I don't think that he will succeed in this.
Prompter Hindi. Mr. Goncharenko, one last question before I let you go, and I want to ask you, do you really think this summit that's happening, the two-day summit that's happening, and the kind of support that Vladimir Putin and Kremlin is trying to rally for themselves, do you think that's going to have any effect on the war in itself, or is this more just about optics for Putin?
I don't think that there will be any influence on the war in itself. I think that that is just one more sign that Russia lost its geopolitical influence, and Russia really does not have any allies in the world except of Iran, Northern Korea, and Belarus, and Syria. So just on the fingers of one hand you can count. So that will be just sign of this, and I don't think that this summit will change anything significantly.
Right. Right, Mr. Goncharenko, thank you so much for speaking with us here
Thank
on
you.
News 18 Global and sharing your perspective on that. Now, Russia and Vladimir Putin definitely hope that this summit is more about optics and there is something substantive that comes out of it, because there is a lot at stake for Russia. There's also a lot at stake for the African nations who are congregating there in St. Petersburg. What can we expect? What are both sides expecting and what can they gain? Take a look.
Russian President Vladimir Putin's Showcase Russia-Africa Summit welcomes delegations from across the continent on Thursday. It's an event set against the backdrop of Russia withdrawing from the Black Sea Agreement. The deal had allowed Ukraine to ship grain out of its southern ports despite a 17-month-old conflict. As such, grain will be in focus in St. Petersburg. African leaders are expected to seek assurance from Putin on grain supplies. Chicago wheat futures, a benchmark of global prices, have risen around 20% since Russia ended the deal on July 17th. They are now at their highest levels since February, though well below their peaks of 2022. In a pre-summit article on the Kremlin website, Putin writes that the Black Sea deal had been shamelessly exploited by U.S. and European trading firms, and that less than 3% of the grain shipped had reached the poorest countries.
They acted like a vacuum cleaner, wiping out all provisions on the global food market to their own advantage, abusing their monopoly, and putting developing countries at a disadvantage.
Putin also says Russia is expecting a record harvest this year. He says it's ready to fill the gap for African countries by supplying grain commercially and for free. Behind the scenes, some countries are expected to seek more information about the future of the Wagner mercenary group. That's after it staged a short-lived mutiny in Russia last month. It provides security muscle for governments in the Central African Republic and Mali. Russia says there will also be further discussion of an African peace initiative for the Ukraine conflict. However, Putin's response when presented with the proposal last month was to repeat a familiar list of accusations against Ukraine in the West. Putin is prevented from traveling to many countries because of an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court. That makes the Russia-Africa Summit an opportunity for him to hold center stage before leaders from an entire continent. Russia says 49 African delegations are taking part. However, that includes just 17 heads of state, sharply down from the 45 who attended the last event in 2019. Russia accuses the West of trying to sabotage the event by dissuading leaders from attending. African governments have mostly remained neutral on the war in Ukraine, as they balance their own relationships with both Russia and the West. Some have had strong ties with Moscow since the Cold War. Many are sympathetic to Putin's idea of countering U.S. dominance in a new multipolar world order. However, most have closer economic links with the U.S. and Europe.
We are, of course, pleased to welcome here the heads of states and governments who have come. We are pleased to welcome all the other representatives who have come from the vast majority of countries in Africa. We are looking forward to a very busy summit, a productive summit in the coming days. And as for the reduction in the number of heads of states who have come, yes, indeed, this has happened recently. This is largely due to the working plans of the heads of state, but there is also, of course, a part of what we talked to you about the day before. This is absolutely unconcealed brazen interference by the United States of America, France, and other states through their diplomatic missions in African countries, and attempts to put pressure on the leadership of these countries in order to prevent their active participation in the forum. That is indeed a fact. It is a fact, and it is absolutely outrageous, but it will in no way prevent the success of the summit.
The world is paying the price for Russia's barbaric attacks. So let's not both sides this issue. Only one country is weaponizing food. Only one country is cynically using its grain as leverage in order to secure support from other countries. And only one country is responsible for the suspension of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. We must all urge Russia to cease its attacks on global food security and extend expand, and fully implement the Black Sea Grain Initiative. And we must continue to hold Russia accountable for its unprovoked illegal war against Ukraine.
Sanjay Suri, my colleague, joining us, getting us the latest on this. Sanjay, as far as the repercussions of this war go, they've been felt world over the last 17 months. But as far as the African nations go, the most important impact and the most recent one for them has been the Russia's decision to withdraw out of the Black Sea grain deal. That is causing severe repercussions, severe situations in several African nations. Can Vladimir Putin then actually count on them to ally with Russia?
Well, he is in fact trying to turn that whole situation on its head and trying to present the end of the Black Sea Grain Initiative as the beginning of the flow of grain to Africa. It has been Russia's argument that the grain that was exported through the initiative never found its way to the poorer countries. It did, of course, the relative abundance of grain on the market help stabilize prices, but that was indirect benefit. Now, Russia is promising direct support, direct flow of grain to a number of African countries, and this is the principle of the three promises that Russia is holding out: food, fertilizer, fuel. Fertilizer, of course, feeds the growth of grain and other produce within Africa, and then the fuel at advantageous prices. These are two huge temptations that Russia is offering, that there will be more food and fertilizer in dealing directly and more actively with Russia, and that countries could gain fuel at prices competitive rather than getting that fuel off the market at very exorbitant prices.
As far as the optics go, Sanjay, what is perhaps the aim or the motive behind this entire summit that Vladimir Putin would be looking at? Because we've seen how the world has stood by Ukraine all through the war over the last 17 months, not just in terms of words, but in terms of actions and military aid, financial aid that has come to the fore as well. And one by one, Russia has only lost its allies.
Well, Russia clearly has lost a lot of allies, even in Africa, and we saw that in the 2019 summit, you had a very much higher attendance at the top level than we are seeing currently in St. Petersburg. It is also clear, on the other hand, that Russia did gain some level of indirect support from African countries that refused to vote against it in the United Nations, and that is a very significant element here, because the Russians are very clearly looking to gain support within United Nations for their position to be maintained internationally. Clearly a lot at stake here, and also the Russians are very keen on trying to get African countries on board here for a purpose of what they see as an ideological alternative to US and Western European dominance, and that does echo quite strongly within Africa. There's a lot of fundamental and subterranean feeling within Africa, and not always subterranean, against an ideological dominance by the West and what is seen as neocolonialism. That sort of rings a chord, and that is something that Russia is working on to try and win over a lot of African countries. So both ideologically, both by way of these ideas about countering Western dominance, and backed with a more promise of direct food supplies, fertilizer supplies, and fuel at an advantageous price.